We turn now to our gospel lesson for today, which comes from the Gospel of Mark, the 10th chapter, verses 35 through 45. James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came forward to him, Jesus, and said to him, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." And he said to them, "What is it you want me to do for you?" And they said to him, "Grant us to sit, one at your right hand and one at your left, in your glory." But Jesus said to them, "You do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with?" They replied, "We are able." Then Jesus said to them, "The cup that I drink, you will drink. And with the baptism with which I am baptized, you will be baptized. But to sit at my right hand or at my left is not mine to grant, but is for those for whom it has been prepared." When the 10 heard this, they began to be angry with James and John. So Jesus called them and said to them, "You know that among the Gentiles, those whom they recognize as their rulers lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them. But it is not so among you. But whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you must be slave of all. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many." When last we saw James and John, we didn't actually see them. That is, we probably didn't notice them because in the text that Andrew preached last week, they were part of the group, the disciples. And in that moment, there was no particular reason that James and John should be seen. It's not all that common for individual disciples to stand out in a gospel story. When that happens, the one usually standing out is Peter, and indeed Peter did speak in last week's text. Do you remember? Mark 10, chapter 28, Peter began to say to Jesus, "Look, we've left everything to follow you." Actually, though, James and John could have said those words along with Peter, because like Peter, they exemplify those disciples who left everything. In the very first chapter of Mark, Jesus first called Peter with his brother Andrew, and then just a couple of lines later, he called James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John, and they left their father Zebedee in the boat with the hired men and followed him. Everything. Well, Peter, James, and John became Jesus' inner circle. In some particularly significant moments, these three are the only disciples Jesus allows to accompany him. That happens in the raising of Jairus' daughter in chapter 5. In chapter 9, these three alone are witness to Jesus' transfiguration on top of the mountain. And they also go down that mountain with him, talking along the way. What an opportunity. What would you talk to Jesus about if you had that kind of time with him? Would you take the chance to ask him your deepest questions? Would you approach the opportunity in humility, entering it as a time to search your heart and try your ways so that you might conform more and more to the will of God? Would you present yourself before your friend and teacher and ask, "What do you want me to do today? And as I do it, how will I better understand who you have made me to be?" If you are Peter or James or John, then your closeness to Jesus surely gives you that opportunity for asking. What then will you ask? You might as well ask Jesus something. You have, after all, left everything behind and followed him. And he seems to have given you a special place in his ministry, so it makes sense, doesn't it, to bring your questions into that place where you are alone with him. When I'm preparing a sermon on a gospel text, I like to go back to the beginning of whatever gospel it is and read up to the text for the day so that I remember everything that happened before we got to that moment in the story. In reading up to today's text, one thing I notice is that once the 12 disciples are assembled and named, which happens in chapter 3, They move and speak as a single body. The disciples said this, the disciples went there. But that changes in chapter 8, verse 29, when Peter finds that solo voice again to declare that Jesus is the Messiah. And in response, Jesus begins to describe his own future suffering, at which point Peter takes Jesus aside to rebuke him. And after that, the disciples seem a little bit less united as a body. More of their conversation seems to happen somewhere to the side. There's some huddling. There are times when the disciples stand apart from Jesus, actually afraid to speak to him, either because they don't understand him or they do and they know they have messed up. For example, not long before today's story, the disciples argue with one another as they walk along the road, and when Jesus says, "Hey, what are you guys arguing about?" they retreat into silence. Maybe you remember what they were arguing about. Which one is the greatest? This is the background for last week's text, in which Peter blurted, "Lord, look, we've left everything to follow you." James and John surely heard Peter say that. And now maybe they too are thinking about what they've left and wondering whether they are using their opportunity, their special relationship with Jesus, to their best advantage. So James and John, walking behind Jesus with the other disciples on the road to Jerusalem, increase their pace just a bit, just enough so that they can reach Jesus and speak to him alone. No big deal. Everyone knows they're close. Everyone knows James and John are part of the inner circle. They just want to take an opportunity to ask him something. But there's asking as in questions, and there's asking as in a request. Listen again to this sentence. We want you to do for us whatever we ask of you. This is a statement about James and John. It is not a question for Jesus. It is not a question at all. It's not even a request. It's a demand. And of course, the joke or the tragedy, so hard sometimes to separate those two, is that they make this demand right after Jesus has told them for the third time where he's headed. If I were in a close relationship with James and John so that I could freely ask them questions, I think I might ask, what part of mock, spit on, flog, and kill sounded like glory to you? When Jesus asks them, are you able to drink the cup that I drink or be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with? In other words, are you able to suffer as I will? James and John respond, we are able. We could cross out able and substitute delusional. These two members of the inner circle will not, in fact, be able to suffer as Jesus does. These two who so badly want to be seen will, in the end, run away to avoid being seen. They have so much opportunity in their special relationship with Jesus to be transformed. So many opportunities to ask questions whose answers will help them conform to the will of God. And it seems that they are rather poor stewards of this great opportunity. It seems, that is, that they blow it. Meanwhile, the other disciples behind them on the road have seen James and John maneuver their way forward, and they've heard their conversation with Jesus. And so the 10, it says, are grumbling among themselves. Isn't it interesting how James and John, in their maneuvering, have suddenly divided the 12 into the 2 and the 10? But Jesus reunites the body, calling them back together to teach them all the meaning of discipleship, what it means to be like Jesus. It doesn't mean setting yourself apart or claiming special privilege, lording it over others. It doesn't mean elevating yourself to a position where everyone can see you and marvel at how wonderful you are. If you're following Jesus, you may indeed be seen, but you will be seen doing the work of a servant. You will be seen subjecting yourself to the need of another as a slave. You might even be seen giving your life. And you won't do it to be seen, but others may well see you, and that will be important in ways that you will never know. Well, James and John wanted to be seen, and James and John instead got schooled. And yet how Jesus must have loved them, that he would forgive their impertinence and call once more in the gospel on their very special relationship, asking that they, along with Peter, accompany him to the Garden of Gethsemane. This happens toward the end of Mark. What an opportunity. How much they might have learned that night about asking. How much they would have learned from hearing Jesus pray, "Not my will, Father, but yours, not what I want, but what you want." How much it could have meant to them to hear Jesus ask to be conformed to the will of God. How much they might have been transformed had they only been able to stay awake. Now, would that have made them great? What is greatness in the kingdom of God? Do you wonder about that? I do. I wonder why Jesus says, "Whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you must be slave of all." The idea of wishing for greatness or being first seems to me antithetical to equality in Christian community. It would make more sense to me if Jesus had said, "James and John, aspire to servanthood and forget about greatness." In passing, let me note that wishing Jesus had used different words has never produced good fruit for me. You know, however I may struggle with the idea of Christian greatness, there are lots of Christians I admire. Some of them are figures from American history like Dr. King. Some of them are figures in church history, Pope Francis right now. Some of them are figures from Moravian history. I know you think I'm going to say Zinzendorf, but today I pick Rebecca Proughton, and I'll be happy to tell you about her sometime. A lot of the people I admire as Christians are right here in this congregation. I'd say about all of these people there's a certain greatness, but I doubt that any of them would think of it that way. They'd probably say they just asked how God wanted them to live in this world, and then they tried to live that way. The quality that we call greatness, which makes people tend to stand out, may simply be how people look when they truly live out their unique calling from God. Even though they would never lord anything over others, still they stand out. They're certainly seen. And that is important in ways they will never know. I have to believe that the greatness of these fellow Christians comes from their stewardship of their relationship with Jesus Christ. That is, they have continually taken the opportunities their relationship with Jesus has made available to them. The opportunity to be in conversation with the divine, to listen, to ask questions, lots of questions, deep questions, scary questions. The opportunity to respond to the answers. The opportunity to be conformed more and more to whatever God wills for each of them. Sisters and brothers, each of us is in a relationship with Jesus. And that means we all have the opportunity of asking. Today is Stewardship Commitment Sunday, and I know the sermon for this day often talks a lot about what God asks of us. But today, I'd like us to think about what we ask of God. Are we using every opportunity to ask God what's important? Not the kind of asking that seeks reward, that divides us from the body, that begs to be seen, but the kind of asking that helps us see how God sees us. Do we begin our prayers with, "God, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you"? Or do we begin with, "God, what do you want us to do today. And God, who am I? And God, who are you? So many questions. Let us be good stewards of opportunity. So much of God is ours for the asking. Just ask. Amen.